New Mexico, 1993. So that gives you some sense. So I would have funded it in 1990. Los Alamos, which was the high-energy lab up in New Mexico, was losing all its scientists.
And Los Alamos, it was where Oppenheimer and where a lot of the nuclear weapons program, the bomb.
That's where the Manhattan Project.
Manhattan Project was.
Something about this testimony doesn't sit right, and you can feel it before a single answer even lands. A man who stood at the center of one of the darkest financial networks in modern history now claims he saw nothing, knew nothing, suspected nothing. Yet his name appears thousands of times across documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein's empire. This isn't just another interview. It's a moment where tone, hesitation, and carefully chosen words begin to matter more than the answers themselves. Because sometimes, what isn't said speaks louder than everything else. And this deposition is filled with those silences. The moment the deposition begins, there's an immediate shift in atmosphere. Controlled, calculated, almost rehearsed. Sitting under oath, Richard Kahn presents himself as someone who was simply doing a job. Numbers, paperwork, transactions, that was his world. Nothing more, nothing deeper. At least, that's the version he wants the committee, and everyone watching, to accept. But the weight of who he worked for makes that narrative difficult to take at face value. Because this wasn't just any client, this was Jeffrey Epstein, a man whose operations, wealth, and connections have been dissected for years. A man accused of running a system so deeply embedded that it allegedly involved powerful figures, complex financial flows, and a disturbing pattern of abuse. And right in the middle of that system sat his accountant, the person responsible for tracking the money. So when Kahn calmly states that he had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, it immediately creates tension. Not because it's impossible, but because of how much access his role would have given him. He emphasizes this repeatedly. His relationship with Epstein, he says, was strictly professional. No social gatherings, no parties, no personal involvement, just business. Clean, simple, compartmentalized. On paper, that sounds reasonable, but the deeper the questioning goes, the harder it becomes to ignore the contradictions that start to surface. Not necessarily in what he says, but in what his position implies. Kahn wasn't just handling small accounts or isolated transactions. He was managing financial operations tied to a man reportedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Wire transfers, tax filings, payroll, distributions. He had visibility into the structure of Epstein's financial ecosystem. And when you consider that many allegations against Epstein involved financial exchanges, payments, gifts, travel, it raises a critical question without anyone even needing to say it out loud. How do you manage the money without seeing what the money is doing? Still, Kahn maintains his stance, firm, unshaken. He claims that during all his years working with Epstein, he never saw anything that suggested abuse or trafficking. No suspicious entries, no alarming transactions, nothing in the records that indicated illegal activity. Even when pressed, he doubles down. There were no payments labeled inappropriately, no red flags that stood out in the books. And that's where things get interesting. Because the absence of obvious labels doesn't necessarily mean the absence of questionable activity. Financial systems, especially at that level, aren't always transparent on the surface. Payments can be disguised, categorized broadly, or routed in ways that don't immediately raise suspicion unless you're actively looking for something. And that brings the focus back to awareness. Was he not looking? Or was there simply nothing to see? Kahn leans heavily into the idea that he was unaware, completely unaware. According to him, no victim ever approached him. No employee raised concerns. No situation ever presented itself in a way that made him question what was happening behind the scenes. But then comes a critical turning point in the narrative. The moment when Epstein's 2008 conviction enters the picture. This is where the tone subtly shifts. Because now, it's no longer about complete ignorance. It's about what happens after awareness begins. Kahn admits that he knew about the case. He knew that Epstein had been accused of involvement with a minor. He knew there had been legal consequences. And yet, he stayed. When asked why, his answer is layered with justification, but also regret. He explains that Epstein told him it was a mistake, that he didn't know the individual was underage, that it would never happen again. And at the time, Kahn says, he believed him. That belief becomes the foundation of his decision. But it wasn't the only factor. He points to the broader context, the financial crisis, the responsibility of supporting a family, the uncertainty of leaving a stable position. These are real-world pressures, the kind that complicate decisions and blur moral clarity. And in hindsight, he acknowledges it plainly. He made the wrong choice. That admission is one of the few moments where the carefully structured narrative shows a crack, not a collapse, but a shift. It introduces the idea that even if he didn't know everything, he knew enough to question whether he should remain. And yet, he stayed for years after that. From 2009 to 2019, Kahn continued working with Epstein, a full decade. During that time, he insists he never saw any signs of ongoing misconduct. No minors, no suspicious interactions, no financial indicators, nothing that would push him to walk away. It's a claim that sits at the center of everything, because if true, it suggests a level of separation between Epstein's public allegations and his internal operations. But if not, it raises a much darker possibility, that the signs were there, just not acknowledged. The committee doesn't directly accuse him of lying, but the line of questioning makes it clear they're testing the boundaries of his credibility. They dig into the details. Did he ever verify ages of individuals receiving money? Did he review financial records closely enough to catch irregularities? Did anything at all, ever feel off? Kahn's answers remain consistent, controlled, careful. He explains that employment documentation included dates of birth, that payroll processes followed standard procedures, that nothing in those records indicated the presence of minors. Even when discussing gifts, some reaching tens of thousands of dollars, he maintains that nothing stood out as inappropriate based on the information available to him at the time. And yet, even within those explanations, there are moments that feel incomplete. Not outright contradictions, but gaps. Spaces where certainty fades into assumption. For example, when asked whether he actively verified ages, his response isn't a firm yes. Instead, it leans toward general compliance, trusting the system, relying on standard processes, not specifically checking each detail unless something seemed off. But that loops back to the same unresolved tension. What qualifies as something off in a system designed to look normal? As the deposition continues, the focus expands beyond just what Kahn knew and into what he may have indirectly facilitated. Not participation in crimes, but the possibility of enabling, even unknowingly, through financial management. Because in cases like this, the infrastructure matters. Money doesn't just move randomly. It follows systems, approvals, structures. And those structures are often maintained by people who may never see the full picture, but still play a role in keeping everything running. Kahn, however, firmly distances himself from that implication. He reiterates that he never saw payments tied to illegal activity, never processed anything labeled in a way that would raise suspicion, never encountered documentation that explicitly connected finances to abuse or trafficking. And legally, that distinction matters, because absence of evidence, at least within the scope of his work, creates a layer of plausible deniability. It allows him to stand by his claim without directly contradicting known facts, while also avoiding admission of oversight. But from a broader perspective, it leaves a lingering question. Is it possible to be that close to something so massive and truly see nothing? That question doesn't get answered here, not definitively. Instead, what unfolds is a carefully balanced narrative, one where responsibility is acknowledged just enough to appear honest, but not enough to imply involvement. Where regret is expressed, but framed within circumstances rather than decisions. Where knowledge is limited to what can be proven, and everything beyond that remains outside the scope. And as the deposition moves forward, that balance becomes the defining feature of Kahn's testimony. Measured, controlled, technically consistent, but never entirely settling the doubt that surrounds it. As the deposition pushes forward, the tone subtly tightens, not louder, not more aggressive, but sharper. The questions begin to close in, not just on what Richard Kahn claims he didn't know, but on what he should have known given the sheer proximity of his role. Because at this level, ignorance isn't just a statement. It becomes something that has to be examined from every angle, and that's where the financial layer becomes impossible to ignore. Kahn wasn't just observing numbers, He was orchestrating the movement of wealth tied to Jeffrey Epstein's entire operation. That includes handling wire transfers, reviewing accounts, preparing tax documentation, and in some cases, distributing funds. In any high-level financial structure, especially one involving hundreds of millions of dollars, patterns emerge: consistent flows, recurring payments, unusual spikes, or transactions that don't quite align with standard business activity. So naturally, the committee leans into that. They begin probing whether anything in those financial records ever raised suspicion, not necessarily something explicitly labeled as illegal, but anything that felt inconsistent, excessive, or simply out of place. Kahn's answer remains steady. He says no. No suspicious transactions, no alarming entries, no unusual notations in ledgers, nothing that suggested criminal activity, whether related to trafficking or anything else. But this is where the conversation becomes more nuanced, because financial misconduct rarely announces itself in obvious terms. It doesn't show up as illegal payment or criminal expense in a ledger. It's often buried within otherwise normal-looking transactions, categorized as consulting fees, travel expenses, gifts, or operational costs. And Kahn acknowledges none of that. Instead, he leans into the technicality. He never saw anything explicitly indicating wrongdoing. That phrasing becomes important. It's precise, legally safe, but it also leaves room for interpretation. Because not seeing something labeled doesn't necessarily mean not seeing something questionable. The committee, recognizing this, shifts direction slightly. If nothing appeared suspicious on paper, what about the people connected to those transactions? That's when the focus turns toward individuals within Epstein's orbit: assistants, employees, and associates who may have received financial support or had their own dealings tied to his accounts. Kahn admits that he did at times provide financial assistance to some of these individuals, specifically preparing tax returns as a favor. Names come up, including Karina Shuliak, who was widely reported to be close to Epstein during his later years. Again, nothing illegal is admitted here. On the surface, it's framed as routine. Helping employees with taxes isn't unusual for someone in his position. But it reinforces a key point. He wasn't completely detached from the people around Epstein. He had interactions. Limited, perhaps, but present. And yet, even with that proximity, he maintains that no one ever expressed concern. No one approached him with allegations. No one indicated that anything inappropriate was happening. That consistency becomes almost too perfect, because in a case as expansive and as widely reported as Epstein's, the idea that not a single signal, verbal, behavioral, or financial, reached someone in Kahn's position starts to feel less like clarity and more like isolation. Whether that isolation was real or constructed is something the deposition never fully resolves. Then, the conversation pivots into one of the most critical dimensions of Epstein's case: the financial aftermath. What happened after his death? Because when Epstein died in 2019, his estate didn't just disappear. It became a massive, complex financial entity responsible for handling lawsuits, settlements, and compensation claims from victims. And Kahn wasn't just a bystander in that process. He became one of the co-executives managing it. That role alone changes everything. It means that whatever he didn't know before, he was now in a position where he had to know more. He was reviewing claims, analyzing settlements, and dealing directly with the consequences of Epstein's actions. And through that process, he admits something significant. He learned the extent of the abuse. Not through observation during his employment, but afterward, through the legal and financial dismantling of Epstein's estate. He acknowledges that there were hundreds of victims, that the scale was far greater than he had previously understood. That admission adds a layer of retrospective awareness. It doesn't prove what he knew before, but it confirms what he knows now. And that distinction becomes central to how his entire testimony is framed. Because now the question isn't just about ignorance, it's about timing. When did he know? What did he know at each stage? And what decisions did he make based on that knowledge? The committee then begins dissecting one of the more controversial aspects of the estate: the Victim Compensation Program. This fund was established to provide settlements to individuals who claimed they were abused by Epstein. It was, in many ways, an attempt to resolve claims outside of prolonged litigation, faster payouts, less public exposure, but also structured agreements that came with conditions. Kahn was directly involved in this process, and that involvement opens the door to a deeper line of questioning, particularly around how those settlements were structured and what limitations were placed on victims in exchange for compensation. One of the most revealing concepts discussed here is something called a carve-out. At first glance, it sounds technical, but its implications are significant. A carve-out essentially allowed victims to accept a settlement from Epstein's estate while still preserving their right to pursue legal action against specific individuals outside of that agreement. Without such carve-outs, accepting compensation could potentially prevent them from suing others who may have been involved. So when the committee asks about these carve-outs, they're not just asking about legal mechanics. They're asking whether there were other individuals who needed to be excluded from protection. And Kahn confirms that there were. Names come up. High-profile names: Alan Dershowitz, Prince Andrew, Leon Black, Jess Staley. These were individuals specifically carved out from certain settlement protections, meaning victims retained the ability to pursue claims against them independently. Now, Kahn is careful here. He does not state that these individuals were guilty of anything. He does not confirm allegations. He simply acknowledges that carve-outs existed and that these names were included in that context. But even without direct accusations, the implication is difficult to ignore. Carve-outs don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because there is at least the possibility, or the claim, of involvement beyond the central figure. And the fact that these names appear in that context reinforces the broader narrative that Epstein's world may not have been limited to just one or two individuals. Still, Kahn keeps his distance from that conclusion. He repeatedly emphasizes that he cannot speak to what others did, that his role, even as co-executive, was limited to reviewing claims and managing the estate, not determining the validity of every allegation beyond what was legally presented. It's a careful line to walk, and he walks it consistently. But then comes a moment that complicates his credibility in a different way. Not through contradiction of facts, but through inconsistency. The discussion shifts to a specific claimant, referred to as Jane Doe 4. Initially, Kahn suggests that she received a settlement through mediation with the estate. It's a straightforward statement, delivered without hesitation. But then, just a day later, that clarity disappears. According to follow-up communication from the committee, Kahn reportedly revises his position. First, he claims that no settlement was reached. Then, in another conversation, he states that he can neither confirm nor deny whether a settlement occurred. That shift, subtle on the surface, introduces a critical issue. Because in a deposition where precision matters, changing an answer like that doesn't go unnoticed. It doesn't necessarily prove deception. Memory can be imperfect, especially when dealing with hundreds of claims and complex legal processes. But it does raise a question about reliability. If details of that magnitude can shift within 24 hours, what does that say about the certainty of everything else? The contradiction lies not in what he says, but in how it all fits together. On one hand, Richard Kahn portrays the role as exhausting, burdensome, and personally damaging, a responsibility no one would willingly choose, filled with legal chaos and emotional strain tied to the aftermath of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. Yet on the other hand, that same role is connected to a potential $25 million payout, an amount that fundamentally shifts how that burden is perceived. Because if the role was purely sacrificial, defined by stress and reputational harm, then why was it valued so highly within the estate? And more importantly, why him? Kahn attempts to rationalize this by framing the bequest as a substitute for standard executive compensation, essentially arguing that the figure aligns with what he could have earned under different circumstances. But that explanation doesn't fully resolve the tension. It simply reframes it. Because the issue isn't just the money, it's what the money represents: trust, proximity, long-term loyalty. And when those elements intersect with years of claimed unawareness, the narrative becomes harder to separate into clean, independent pieces. Because while he claims the role came with immense burden, he also acknowledges the scale of what was initially promised. And even if he now believes he may receive nothing due to ongoing liabilities and legal costs, the existence of that bequest still matters. It establishes that Epstein valued him, not just as an employee, but as someone worth rewarding at a level few others reached. And that brings the conversation back to motive. Because in any legal or investigative context, financial incentive becomes a critical lens through which credibility is evaluated. Not proof of wrongdoing, but a factor that can influence decisions, loyalty, and even silence. The committee doesn't explicitly accuse Kahn of acting out of self-interest, but the implication is there, quietly embedded in the line of questioning. And Kahn, aware of that, tries to neutralize it. He explains that under normal circumstances, if he had served as a corporate trustee, he might have earned a similar amount, around $12 million, through standard executive fees. So in his view, the bequest wasn't excessive. It was simply a different way of compensating him for a role that would otherwise have been paid through structured fees. It's a technical argument, and like much of his testimony, it's carefully constructed. But whether it fully answers the underlying concern is another matter, because the issue isn't just how the money was justified, it's how it connects to everything that came before it. Years of working alongside Epstein, years of claiming no awareness, years of remaining in position even after a conviction. And at the end of that timeline, a multi-million-dollar inclusion in the estate. That sequence doesn't prove anything on its own, but it adds weight to the broader question of whether Kahn's perspective, his interpretation of events, his recollection of details, might be influenced by more than just memory. And that question lingers as the deposition moves into another critical area: law enforcement. Because if Kahn truly had the level of access he describes, then naturally, investigators would have wanted to speak with him at some point. After all, financial records often hold the key to uncovering patterns, connections, and hidden operations. So when he's asked whether he was ever formally questioned by authorities, his answer is surprisingly simple. No. No interviews, no direct questioning, no formal interrogation. The only contact he describes comes in the form of document requests, subpoenas asking for estate records, trust details, and financial documentation. Information, not testimony. And that revelation opens up an entirely different layer of concern, because it suggests that one of the individuals closest to Epstein's financial operations was never fully examined as a witness, not in a way that would involve direct questioning, cross-examination, or detailed scrutiny of his personal knowledge. From an investigative standpoint, that absence is difficult to ignore. It doesn't mean mistakes were made. It doesn't confirm that anything was overlooked, but it does contribute to the broader sense of uncertainty that has surrounded the entire Epstein case for years. Questions about who was investigated, who wasn't, and whether every possible lead was fully explored. Kahn's testimony doesn't resolve those questions, but it reinforces them. And as the deposition approaches its conclusion, the focus circles back to the core issue that has been present from the very beginning. Why did he stay? Not just in 2008, when Epstein's legal troubles first became public. Not just during the years that followed, but even after new reports emerged, after deeper investigations, after more details began to surface. Kahn's answer remains consistent with what he said earlier, but now it carries more weight, because everything else has already been laid out. He says that after Epstein's release, he never saw any signs of ongoing misconduct. No minors, no abuse, no suspicious transactions, nothing that would push him to leave. And when new information surfaced later, particularly through major reporting that expanded on the scope of Epstein's actions, he describes himself as overwhelmed, busy managing financial fallout, dealing with banking issues, handling urgent matters that demanded immediate attention. In that chaos, he says, he didn't step away. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't pause. And that explanation introduces something that runs quietly beneath the entire deposition. The idea that sometimes, decisions aren't made through clear moral judgment, but through momentum. One task leads to another. One responsibility replaces the next. And before you realize it, years have passed without a definitive break. Whether that explanation is convincing depends entirely on the perspective of the viewer, because the deposition never provides a definitive answer. It doesn't prove that Kahn knew everything. It doesn't prove that he knew nothing. Instead, it leaves behind a series of carefully delivered statements, each one technically consistent, but collectively open to interpretation. And that's what makes this testimony so compelling. It's not about a single contradiction or a single revelation. It's about the space between certainty and doubt. The space where credibility is measured not just by facts, but by tone, timing, and context. Kahn presents himself as a professional who is kept in the dark. The circumstances suggest someone who is close enough to see more. And somewhere between those two versions is where the truth likely exists. But that truth isn't handed to you. It's something you have to evaluate for yourself, by looking at the patterns, the pauses, the shifts in language, and the moments where clarity gives way to careful phrasing. Because in cases like this, the full story rarely comes from what's said outright. It comes from everything surrounding it. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think he genuinely had no idea what was happening behind the scenes? Or does his testimony feel a little too controlled to be completely real? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who follows these cases, and subscribe for more deep dives into stories that don't always have clear answers, but definitely deserve a closer